Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This is episode 93. We're going to be talking about The Final Girl Support Group, the Grady Hendrix book from 2021. You can email us at whatthe, WHATTHE, at scarythoughts.org. And I think we have a plug we should do before we go any further.
Yeah, I would say before you listen to this episode, it would be really great for you to go listen to Midnight Mass, the new podcast by
Peaches Christ and Michael Varrati.
If you know who Peaches Christ is, I mean, I'm sure you probably do if you're listening to the show, a drag icon from San Francisco who is, I mean, how would you describe Peaches Christ? Like a
midnight movie maven.
Yeah, that's God, if there's anybody whose career I'm jealous of, it's Peaches Christ. And to a certain extent, Grady Hendrix, the author of this book. I think what they both have in common, and I think what we'll talk about is just what taking this stuff really seriously and lovingly can do, and, you know, like the place it has in the world and how people experience these things.
And episode 3 of that podcast, Midnight Mass, is their Friday the 13th episode, and they interview Adrienne King, who was the final girl of the original Friday the 13th and was also in part 2. But then they also interview Grady Hendrix to talk about and promote the Final Girl Support Group, and it's a great interview, and it was very, very informative for the podcast we are about to record. In this episode of Scary Thoughts, in addition to discussing the Final Girl Support Group, we will be discussing murderabilia, the creation of Final Girls, and whether or not it is a thing, a real thing. We'll be discussing Carol Clover's book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws.
Narrative structure. I'm sure Rick and Morty will come up at some point as per usual. And you know, I think what I'd really like to get into is like our usual fare of like, you know, what fears this addresses and whether or not this is a nostalgic piece or a meta piece and what the difference between those things are.
And we will also be discussing what a delight Grady Hendrix seems to be as a person and personality. And last thing before we get into it all is spoilers ahead for this book and, you know, probably slashers in general, but they're easy to spoil. They all end the same way.
Yep.
And that's the point.
Yes, you know a girl will make it to the end.
So where do you want to start with this one?
Well, I think we should start talking about Grady Hendrix and what a delight he is.
Yeah.
Before we get super deep into the book. He is great. I watched a bunch of interviews with him. I will probably buy everything he puts out in support of him because I think he's a real historian of this genre, especially the book side of it. You know, in one of his interviews I really liked, he made this distinction between people who write books that feel like they're going to just be movies, and then people who write books that feel like books. And then he was on one of these podcasts. His willingness to entertain podcasts that get no views at all and show up wearing his suit is pretty amazing. Like he has those cream-colored suits. I think it's just very nice for a writer to have like a look like that, which especially in horror, it gives him an almost like John Watersy sort of vibe that he's wearing. Like that he's so exuberant and he's so friendly and he's so knowledgeable and gets just a total glee, like clearly about this stuff. And then he's also very like workmanlike, you know, he's like shows up to work at the horror book factory and cranks out like a good product and markets it. And I have some like kind of criticisms of this type of book that I'll roll out later that will sound very mean, but I would really like to get across the point that I think he is a person to be admired and what he's doing is amazing.
Yeah, we covered his book Horror Store a couple of years ago on this podcast, and he's written, so that was his first proper novel, and he's written several since then. I feel like maybe between the two of us, we've read them all, yeah?
Yeah.
And I think that this is his best by far, actually. Like, he's always been a consistently quite solid writer, but I think that this is a pretty big leap for him, I think, in terms of quite frankly, quality of writing. His earlier novels were sometimes the writing was a little perfunctory. And this one, I found like the language was more lush. Mm-hmm. The twists and turns in the plot were more sort of complicated and unforeseen. It went places that I really didn't predict. And I don't just mean the ending. I mean, just the way the book was composed was not so scripted, even though it's relying on a lot of tropes. The book itself as a story didn't feel predictable to me.
Yeah, it has a good pace. It like really moves.
Yeah.
It doesn't drag anywhere. And being able to write in that real breezy style where your voice gets out of the way of the book is really difficult. It's one of the things I really like about Elizabeth Gilbert's writing.
Fully.
Is a bunch of different ways you could make fun of the whole live, laugh, love lifestyle, but her writing
She's a
is
great
excellent.
writer.
So like whatever you think, that's a fact. And I think there's a little bit of that going on here with him. Like, it's like I realized when I was reading this book, I just don't like this kind of literature, man. I just think horror is mostly shitty. And
You mean horror novels are mostly shitty?
horror novels,
Yeah.
yeah. And then another thing that he did, which I thought was really great, was Paperbacks from Hell, his compendium.
Yeah.
Is just, if you happen to like this literature, and this is just a personal taste thing. Like, I just do not get off on this type of writing in general. And like, I just find the whole slasher thing to be kind of silly, especially when you're like the city of Karachi is real and there's like gang murders happening that are way more horrific than this in Juarez. It's just like the facts of the world's horribleness just always seem to outdo horror to me. And then
Well, that was Francis Bacon's whole thing. Like, what can I do to compete with the reality of the horrors of the lived world?
Yeah, yeah. But that said, like, I think Grady Hendrix has done a really good job of creating a very faithful, fun version of this. I mean, this is an example I use all the time, but it's like he's kind of like a Japanese rockabilly dude. Like he is doing the thing so perfectly, but because it's not an original version of it, it's sort of it's evolved a little bit, but I feel like my criticism of this sort of thing in general is it's like a resto mod car. It's like, yeah, it looks exactly like a 1960s Shelby Mustang and it has a cool new motor in it, but it's not the real thing. And there's something about that like some people love it. It doesn't work for me, but I'm not going to make a moral cause about it like some people would.
Right. If I can just bastardize your metaphor a little, though, I almost feel like it's like someone took last year's Mustang and made it into a hearse, but using a Model T4 wheel set or something like that.
Have you ever seen a car, Mark? I'm just kidding. Like the way they just try. You sort of described the episode when Homer Simpson makes a car.
Yeah,
the Homer car.
So good.
Yeah, totally.
No, I'm just saying, like, this book is not necessarily a recreation. It is a hybridization.
Yeah, I think that's
of a lot
right.
of different things colliding that, I mean, you can like or not like, and that doesn't necessarily inherently make it better, but it's not quite strictly a recreation. It's not Stranger Things.
Mm-hmm.
Its meta-ness is very within the text itself. Like for example, Stranger Things is all retro, and consequently, because it's retro, it's meta.
Mm-hmm.
But other than the Easter eggs, it is not in and of itself meta.
I'm so glad you brought this up because
whereas this is fully meta. This is like, okay, slasher movies are based on true events. Mm-hmm. That's a whole other step.
Yeah. So he, in another interview I watched with Hendrix, he said that somebody had accused him of just basically writing The Watchmen for Final Girls.
Oh, interesting.
And I was like, and he was like, yes. He's like, I'll never write anything as good as The Watchmen. He's like, but I'll take it. And I thought that like him saying that was really interesting because you're right. Like this isn't a nostalgic piece, even though you sort of have to have like an awareness of the past of these things, or at least the idea of what a final girl is to even want to pick this off the shelf, But once you sort of like are drawn into the idea that, slashes are a thing, people responding to them in a certain way is a thing, and the fact that the entire like category of a final girl has been sort of elevated into this completely different thing, like a psychopolitical sort of deal. This to me is not retro in any way, but because it advances the plot, it puts the elements that would be retro in the here and now. Whereas I think his book, My Best Friend's Exorcism, was a little bit more retromania. Like it was a little bit more playing with like it took place in a time and a place.
Yeah.
And so it has that feel to it. And it's also, obviously the cover was like the paperback cover was so much better than the hardcover. It looked like a VHS.
Yeah.
It was just so rad. And then it was a little bit ahead of all this shit too. Like that was the kind of a really, I think the other thing about him is he's definitely having these like parallel ideas with other people, but he wrote this book in 2014 before there was like kind of this resurgence of Final Girl material out there. Like now it's like, fuck, it's everywhere.
Yeah, he's been hacking away at this for a long time.
Yeah. And then he talks about like not really sticking the landing in the original version and how he felt like this landing was stuck really hard. I think that like when this is inevitably an HBO show and that final scene happens, I think people who are fans will be delighted by it. Mm-hmm. I thought it was corny as fuck. Like,
that's fair.
Yeah, it's just...
Speaking more about retro versus meta and this, like the intertextuality of what he is doing specifically in this book, is it reminds me of my experiences going to like the Louvre when I was a kid. Maybe that's a bad example because I was so young, but like, let's say the British Museum or any classical museum. Mm. I don't really have much of an investment in classical art, even though I'm very, very invested in contemporary visual art. And a lot of it has to do with that I'm not Christian. And consequently, I don't really care about Christian mythology. Mm-hmm. And so when I look at, even in books or like Caravaggio's or something like that, these great paintings from the Western canon of the last 1,000 years, I don't know who these people are. I don't care about their context and all that. Mm-hmm. But I do understand that that's kind of how the world works. I mean, that is the Marvel Cinematic Universe at this point. I'm not putting Christianity on par with Marvel, but in terms of the function of being invested in a narrative and elevating that narrative such that you consume all parts and those parts all connect to create something greater than the sum.
Yeah.
So when you look at a lot of classical paintings, especially from like, let's say the Italian Renaissance, they are participating in a dialogue with biblical Christian canon.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm another thing I'm super stoked you brought up. Harold Bloom talks a lot about this. And I was thinking a lot about his book, The Anxiety of Influence, just in my personal life, but also in the context of this particular book by this particular author. And then also in the context of like, my favorite author, Cormac McCarthy, because like Grady Hendrix and Cormac McCarthy are kind of doing the same thing. Like, books are made out of books. So you look into the history of the thing you're looking at, and then your understanding of it allows you to create the next version of it. And Harold Bloom's idea is that the true genius, what makes the true genius is that they are wrestling with being influenced by the thing. And they're simultaneously accepting and digesting it and rejecting and cursing the thing. And that the fact that they get their version of it sort of wrong in the context of the world is what drives it into being an evolution and being a new cool thing. Like Cormac McCarthy inhales all these like 1940s Western books, and then out comes Blood Meridian and No Country for Old Men. No Country for Old Men I'd like to bring up a little bit later because I think Anton Chigurh is like a very successful version of the slow stalking slasher.
Who?
The main villain, Anton Chigurh.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think he's basically like Mike Myers, but a billion times cooler. Yeah. But, so there's the anxiety of influence. But then I was thinking, like, for something like this, there's almost like the pleasure of influence. When you think about Grady Hendrix or even like Peaches Christ or any of these people who sort of like come to this as fans first and then they develop a thing, it's its own different line almost.
Yes.
Yeah. And then like a Harold Bloom or even a Schopenhauer, they would say that like culture is this furnace through which, history is formed and art is formed. And there's sort of a main line. And so the main line is like Christianity, great arc, all the canonical stuff. And so if you're a real serious writer, you would, from their perception, want to busy yourself with the work of the great line. And this stuff is like considered like trash, mostly like horror stuff. And Grady Hendrix has this great line about how like we're all going to end up on the discount table eventually anyway, you know, his awareness of what he's doing is just amazing to me. Like he's not trying to write Blood Meridian, you know, he's trying to write these specific books that would delight him. And I think that's just a very good way of going through life. But I was thinking about all that stuff and I'm like, man, and it takes me about the same amount of time to read a shitty book or a book like this as it does like something very serious. So I was like, man, am I just like poisoning my own ability to write greatly by consuming all this stuff? This like kind of lower level stuff. It's like rappers now who just only listen to other SoundCloud rappers. And it's this like copy of shittiness. Like if you're going to be a copy of something, the thing you start with should be great. Or is that just taste? Or is there really something that is actually great?
I think it's just taste, and also I think influence isn't necessarily, you can use a really reductive maxim like garbage in, garbage out. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's not like if you want to be a great writer, you should only read, quote, great writers. I think that is outrageously reductive and totally not true. It gives you insight and it can lead you to think about style in a different way. But I think you and I sort of like disagree with this about this often is I sort of don't make those distinctions quite as emphatically as you do about this idea of great art. Like I think I just don't really give a shit one way or the other. Well, I do appreciate things that require heavy lifting more than things that are light, but I don't necessarily privilege them so very much. I don't necessarily think the Criterion Channel, which I subscribe to, is infinitely more valuable to the history of humankind than Netflix. I totally disagree. I just prefer it.
Well, so I don't know about that. Like I feel
if there was a new season of Flora's Lava available, the second we stopped recording, I would watch that and probably skip a Bergman film.
So this is a different thing. Like so to sit around and enjoy, in this this mode of late stage capitalism where all you can do to really live and entertain yourself is just to like blot out the horror of the day.
Pain.
Yeah. I feel like this kind of like low culture thing, like by taking low culture seriously, like we have since probably, I guess, the 80s, maybe, maybe the argument would be more like the 90s would be kind of when like low culture starts to become a little bit more taken seriously, at least mainstream. Like grunge would be a good example of like sort of the resurgence of punk rock shit, or all the research books that came up around that time, the RE/search, if you're not familiar. It did bring this stuff up in the way that like Amazon Basics are pretty decent for a certain price, but they're not great, and they're just never going to be great. And I think that you like, even Grady Hendrix said it. He's like, if you want to, somebody asked him like, what do you have to do to be a writer? And he's like, you have to read a lot. Stephen King says the same thing. And so you get to a certain point where like, well, you can't just be reading any old thing, and like Schopenhauer specifically said, like, and there's no greater way to develop the mind than to study the ancient classics. And I think that might, maybe not that exact example, but I think that if you were to read, you had two people that read that had the same writing ability, and 100 of them read everything in Paperbacks from Hell, or read 100 books from Paperbacks from Hell, and another guy or a girl read 100 like great books. I feel like the person who read the great books would put out better work, all things being equal.
Possibly. But
or
I
more
guess
important work anyway.
Okay. I would perhaps shift the question, because to me, it really depends on what you want. Because, I think we come back to talking about Tranny Shack all the time, but I think I'll use it as another example. Tranny Shack, the now defunct drag club in San Francisco, is very experimental and crazy and created some of the most extraordinary moments I've ever had watching performance or art of any sort. And I think you might somewhat agree.
It was great.
It was great.
I wish I had been more involved with it.
Yeah. I almost wish I was less involved. I think my head is just so saturated by so many drag shows. I almost never need to see another one. Yeah. But we could talk about great art in reference to drag, but at the same time, if you wanted to be a drag performer in the context of Tranny Shack, it was kind of about like, show up, see your friends perform, be part of the culture, be competitive in a way that's supportive and competitive, and everybody kind of pushes each other and goads each other on to be more outrageous and more weird and more out and engage the audience more aggressively. And so to me, that sort of example isn't about like, well, it's not about a conversation of like, well, what would be the Milton? Who is the Milton of drag? It's sort of like, well, that's not really the point. The point of Tranny Shack was like this culture, this moment, these artists working through their identities, their culture, the situation, and it being about, not about like, well, if you want to make great art, you've got to consume great art. It's like, well, in the context of Tranny Shack, to make an amazing number, you need to be invested and part of that culture. You know what I mean?
To me, that's a different thing. That's like,
I can see that.
That's like folk art to me. And so,
and I don't really, I guess for me, there's not much of a difference between the Western canon and whatever folk art means in its broadest idea and a drag show.
Well, I think to me, like one of the differences I would make is that like, I mean, this is really clumsy calling it high culture, but like the Western canon, and there's similar things in Eastern or like Islamic traditions. There's like the main thing. And the thing about like these like mountains that you have to climb to understand and enjoy is that it's like the Henry Rollins thing, like 200 pounds is always 200 pounds. Milton is always Milton. And I think you could probably really, without too much effort, trace Milton's Lucifer to Tranny Shack as a line of inspiration. Now imagine if like the devil that you started with as inspiration is Dave Grohl and Tenacious D Pick of Destiny. A little down the road, it's like a little shittier, right? Like, so it's like you have to, I think that like, especially in this time and place, there's obviously ways to question and interrogate why the canon is the canon. Obviously like these people had guns and money, so they were able to force it. But like Harold Bloom sort of like anticipated this moment a little bit because he called all the stuff that's happening now the criticism of resentment. And his idea was that like the reason why people resent this stuff so much is because they're incapable of even reaching its heights. And I think there is sort of a point to what he's saying there. But at the same time, I think where he was really blind was like he didn't really look far enough outside of the canon to find these other like these peaks that he would not be aware of. Like he didn't know that like, oh, there's a great mountain range in America, the Appalachians, but maybe he didn't know about the Himalayas in the East. But he was also really anticipated this thing where like the desire to know about these other peaks, these unexplored peaks, made people look at hills that just weren't the mountains and call them mountains.
That's an interesting metaphor. I get it.
Yeah. And, like one of the things he talked about was like, I think he hated Alice Walker's poetry, maybe, I think, or something like that. And the reason why he hated it was because, there's Thalia Mosses out there writing at a much higher. So his whole thing is like, yes, let's please elevate these different cultures, but let's not elevate the stuff that the people who of the culture that are just exploring and don't know the great parts of it would pick. Like, right. I don't know if that makes sense. But,
I get it.
But yeah.
Well, maybe dialing back a bit to how this book in particular advances the story of horror. I think that one thing that it does importantly is that it's not merely, again, just some sort of like, oh, it's retro and it's fun and Final Girl slashers, cool. I think that the thing that it does quite adeptly, I really felt when I read it, and then I realized, oh, I'd never seen Silent Night, Deadly Night, which is the movie franchise that Lynette, the protagonist's character, is based on. Mm-hmm. And in Silent Night, Deadly Night, a random young woman gets picked up, shoved against some antlers, and she's dead. In Final Girl Support Group, she's hung on antlers and is still alive for hours and hours and hours while she watches her family be dismembered, played with, mutilated. And all the while, she's trying to pretend that she's actually dead so that the killer doesn't recognize that she isn't dead yet and actually murder her. And I think that sort of discrepancy is the thing that makes this book very interesting. Like, yes, it's about the inner lives of these disposable, shitty movie characters, but I think that difference in particular, hers, the protagonist's difference, is really marked.
Well, this final girl, I think it just has the misfortune of having come out after Halloween 2018, because because you know that he had this idea before that film existed, you know, and I think if you did not know when these things were created and you saw Halloween 2018 first, you would maybe consider this sort of a ripoff of it. But I think they were just parallel, you know, they were just created in parallel. So I don't think there's any direct influence other than that they have, obviously you're like, oh, the same thing. And then when he talked, I liked that he was like aware of Watchmen or is a fan of Alan Moore, because what he's done is basically what Alan Moore did with the Watchmen characters, which is you introduce a little bit of reality to the situation. But like we talked about in our last episode, if you introduce
episode about Halloween 2018.
We talked about how, you know, one of the comic book artists that worked with Frank Miller talked about how Frank Miller had made it even grittier. And part of that was that like the Watchmen had come out while The Dark Knight was already out, while The Dark Knight was running. And then Frank Miller was like, fuck, I'm just going to like overdo it, you know? Like, so I think it's an interesting parallel between Alan Moore's reification of superheroes and Frank Miller's in this book and Halloween 2018. Grady Hendrix 1 seems to know more about guns and stuff. Like I thought her tactics and the things that like she did in Final Girl Support Group were just way more viable than what Laurie Strode does in Halloween. And I also like how damaged and fucked up all of Grady Hendrix's characters are. They're like all like really uniquely damaged from their unique situations, which I think is really a nice touch to the book.
Totally. I think that another interesting piece of this puzzle is Halloween 2018 foreshadows the release of this book in a certain sense. But I think that part of his research really is about Adrienne King, who was the actor who played the final girl in Friday the 13th, and then was promptly dispatched in the first scene of Friday the 13th Part 2. She notably, and I didn't know this until I heard the interview on the Midnight Mass podcast, that she actually had a really, really aggressive stalker. And it really messed her life up and interfered with her ability to pursue a career, really. And she kind of went into hiding. And so this book is also, in a sense, not just a tribute to Final Girls in the movies, but actually one of the actresses who played a final girl and her real life in this world's story.
Yeah, and she's such a delight. Like it's something like she has like a Crystal Lake wine.
Yeah,
you know, she really like reminds me in some ways of my mom. Like, because like she's an older blonde haired lady who just, you know, still blonde. You know, like after all these years.
Yeah,
and like my mom was a Playboy bunny, and that experience, like, she'll probably be buried in a Playboy coffin, probably. You know, like she wears Playboy jewelry. She's like how people just are always Marines. That's how she is, you know. And you get the feeling that the actor from Friday the 13th is like that about these slasher films.
Right.
And I can't remember if it's in the Midnight Mass interview or another one. Did they talk about how she told the director of the Friday the 13th that she had a situation and they thought it meant that she was pregnant?
Oh, I don't remember that.
Yeah, Grady Hendrix talks about it in one of the interviews, and I can't remember if she talked about it in her interview, but basically she was like, oh, there's a situation. And she didn't say, I have a stalker. So they're like, okay, you know, and she was going to be the lead, but instead, because of their misunderstanding of it, she ended up like being like, oh, well, we're just going to kill you on the first day. And then she showed up thinking she was going to be on the set the whole time, and they just murdered her and said, check you later, put her in her car and sent her on her way. And it's kind of like, it's really nice that Grady Hendrix is kind of revived her legacy a bit, which I think is pretty cool. And he's done this with like all these books from Paperbacks from Hell. He says one of the things that he's most proud of is that he's brought back a lot of these books back into print, and people are starting to see a little bit of money, and it's
That's
like,
cool.
It's very cool.
Going back to something you were saying earlier, the way that all of these final girls in this book approach the world is very idiosyncratic to each of the characters, which I think is interesting. I appreciate how you were bringing up just Lynette's sort of like use of guns. But in this book, all of the final girls have reacted to trauma in incredibly unique ways. And I think that's, for me, one of the most interesting things about this book is that we have these numerous, it's sort of open at, there's obviously like the core team, and none of them die before the end of the book, and they add one who was actually
I thought one of
half
them
of the
dies.
villain. One of the
Doesn't
actual
the first
final girls.
one, does one of the first
Well,
one
Crazy
gets-
Chrissy, she gets hit by the car. Lynette drives the car into her house and smashes a TV against her and kills her.
Right, that's who I thought died.
Yeah.
Yeah. But she's more of a collector. She's not really a final girl.
She was a final girl, but she wasn't part of their elite team.
Weird. I don't remember. Like, that's the one thing I would say about this book is that, like,
I might be getting that wrong.
that's exactly my point.
I could have
is-
sworn that her whole thing was this is how she's dealing with her trauma.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would have to read the book again to know. But, like, that stuff, like the one woman who has the Freddy Krueger dream killer,
Heather.
it's like, did that happen? Or is it
It's
like
vague,
Yeah,
and
it's very
I kind
vague.
of appreciate that it's kind of rooted in reality. But when we visit Chrissy's museum and we go into the room of the dream, oh God, what's it called? The Freddy Krueger nightmare museum room. We're
Scary
given
Terry.
Scary Terry. We're given like no details.
Yeah.
It's incredibly vague. Like there are a couple of things like we don't know what kind of porn Skye is watching when she walks in on him, and we don't know what's in Heather's dream room in Chrissy's museum. But
I think those are like nice writerly touches.
sure, we don't need to know everything.
Yeah, totally.
And also I feel like that is similar to when a character is supposed to have told the funniest joke in history. Like you don't write what that joke is.
Right.
You got to leave it vague. I sort of feel like that's what Grady Hendrix had to do here.
Back to Tenacious D, the best song ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even make that. Yeah, totally. It's interesting that Lynette, whose eyes we see this whole thing through, she's not an unreliable narrator, but we do get a front seat to a lot of bad decisions.
And the thing that's interesting, he could have written her as an unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, if he had done that, this would have been a better book, but it would not have been as pleasing to the audience. So I think he probably made a good call.
But I think that it is parallel to being an unreliable. There is an element of unreliable narrator in her that everything she says, not everything, so much of what she says and insists, so much of her drive is absolutely misguided. That her whole thing is about, we need to protect the group. I need to go and save Danny. Marilyn needs to hear from me. Even Heather deserves protection. But when it comes down to it, she flees. She puts people in danger constantly. All of her decisions are pretty fucking terrible. Almost across the board, she almost never makes a good decision. And so we're following her along, making these really bad acts that hurt a lot of people, but and it works out in the end, in a sense. But what's funny is the antagonists, Skye and Stephanie, they're sort of stumbling through the whole thing too. I think that's one thing about the book that is a little odd. All of Skye and Stephanie's planning ahead of time seems to be incredibly well rolled out tactically with research, technically with computers, master manipulators. Mm-hmm. But everything we witness them do is, other than them just being liars and passing as the characters they want everybody to think they are, they're kind of clumsy and lucky.
It's a little weird. It's like the planning is like Ocean's 11 level.
Yes.
But then they get all like zany teenager falls apart at the end. Like it basically goes from being like Ocean's 11 to being not quite as good as the dudes from Scream.
I totally was thinking of Scream. Yeah. Well, I mean, honestly, Scream is like that. Like the way Scream works is, holy shit, if you map out how these two kids were able to commit all these murders, it's incredibly masterful. But when they're on camera, they're totally inept, can't pull off a good stab.
And, this is where I was thinking about, like, where that idea that, like, reality is poisonous to superheroes, and how, like, I thought, like, also thinking of the Final Girl as a type of superhero, that reality is sort of poisonous to that. Like, I like the falling apart of the plans from the perspective of Lynette is sort of like, if you were being really generous, you could say it's like a metatextual version of the woman falling over shit in the movie. Like she's stumbling, and that's what sort of drives the plot, is the relentless drive of the killer and the fumbling of the heroine. Like those two things are like sort of happening in a really nice ebb and flow. And he does that here, maybe on purpose. I have to assume on purpose, because he's so vested in this stuff.
Well, it also reminds me of the movie that we covered some time ago, Unsane, the Steven Soderbergh film, where we're watching a woman get duped into being locked up into a mental health facility. And part of the problem is that she has a temper and doesn't edit herself very well. So it's very, very easy for her to become reactive and give the people who work at the facility every excuse to use force and control against her when she should be free. And Lynette in this book, I think, is similar, is everybody thinks she's out of control, and anytime she's trying to convince someone that something's wrong, she is completely hysterical, ranting, only half making sense, and not listening to anybody. And it makes it really, she's sort of playing the role that Skye and Stephanie have set her up to play, which is an unreliable person.
Yeah. I mean, to me, like, I like it to get a little bit more loose like that, because I was thinking about, like, what do I like better? Do I like a more realistic sort of thing, or sort of like an operatic sort of situation, like an Evil Dead? And I think that these stories they're repetitive, and they're about death, and they're about overcoming death and surviving. And there's something like very mythological about them. And I think one of the reasons why I sort of like the DC comic, Superman, Swamp Thing, Batman sort of thing, is because they're more godlike than the Marvel characters. The Marvel characters are a little bit more, like, maybe not as like elevated into archetypes as, I mean, they certainly are, but like the DC characters just feel more like that. And I think that the monster chasing the innocent woman is just fucking ancient as an idea, you know? And I think...
Well, it's what Chrissy walks out as she's giving the tour of the museum.
Totally, yeah. And I think when that happens, it can become a little smokier and magical and weird and less logical. And it moves almost into like, Bugs Bunny territory a little bit. And I think I kind of like that for this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we talked last episode when we were talking about Halloween 2018, and a little bit you've said today about your not being into slashers so much. And I think you've described it as being mostly like the world building isn't elaborate enough to keep your interest. Is that...
Like, so if there's mythological elements like devils and demons and shit like that, I think for me personally, I'm just more into that.
Yeah.
Or you could have an experience that is not trying to like root it in reality. Like, for example, Fury Road is not rooted in reality. And like, first, you're like, we're going to get the gasoline. That's about as rooted in reality as it gets. And the rest of it's completely mayhem.
Yeah.
I think that works better. And you see the same thing in Evil Dead 2, like what's more fun, what gets the point across more, Jamie Lee Curtis grabbing a shotgun and saying, "This is tactical," or Ash putting a chainsaw on his stump. You know, it's both horror. Like, I think, like, for whatever reason, and I think it might be beyond taste. Like, you could certainly say, look, that's just your taste. But I think the Evil Dead hand chainsaw is more successful than anything in Halloween 2018. And I think it just would be, and like for a lot of different reasons. Like, I think Sam Raimi's a better director and writer. Like, I think it's just more fun. And it's probably not a like one-to-one comparison or anything like that. But I think allowing the horror elements to become more like dreamlike, I think is better.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I brought it up in particular is because I think my favorite aspect of this book touches on that, which is Chrissy. So the whole way it explores murderabilia, I think, is like epically fascinating.
Yeah, it's really good. It's really rooted in true shit, too.
Well, I mean, you and I mutually know somebody who owns a John Wayne Gacy painting, and it was above his bed for, I mean, it still might be, but, you know, like, that's real.
What a champion.
But we do see in this book, Chrissy makes this pivot in a way to cope with her own trauma, that she gives these simple slasher scenarios mythology. When Lynette refers to the killers as psychopaths in front of Chrissy, Chrissy says, "That's such a small word. Does it make you feel superior to give them a diagnosis, to file them away in a little drawer? You know they're bigger than that. If it were just a psychological problem, we could find a cure. This is a metaphysical problem." And what Hendrix does through the character of Chrissy is he etches out a metaphysics of the slasher.
Mm-hmm.
Not entirely. Like, it's limited because Lynette thinks she's full of shit, and she is. And Chrissy is taking her fantasies and coping mechanisms to the extreme. But I think it is amazing the degree to which Chrissy has made this a metaphysical question, that murder is man's attempt to steal birth from women. You know, Chrissy's whole binary that women are birth and men are death.
Yeah, Chrissy's whole thing is like exceptionally Catholic. Like, you know, she has a reliquary, there's relics.
Yep.
You know, she has like a very, like a binary good versus evil sort of thing. And
right.
Like I thought that whole sequence was really interesting, like, and will probably look awesome on screen, like when they eventually make this. You read this book twice. Did you get anything else out of reading it the second time?
It was fun the second time. Honestly, when I read it the second time, I realized how much of the plot I didn't get the first time. Like, for example, what was Chrissy's original trauma? I think you and I were unable to come up with whether or not... see, I'm doing it now. Like, I'm having a hard time juggling all these characters' names. They're all sort of like these generic Western women names. And consequently, I often find it very hard.
References.
They're all references, but I often, even the second time, I'd be reading it and I'd be like, wait, who's Michelle again?
This is something else I was thinking about.
And so the second time, it gelled a lot of that for me.
Yeah. It's interesting how some authors can introduce a million characters with different names, and they're so like Tolstoy. You read Anna Karenina, every single character has like a royal name, a nickname, their childhood nickname, their real name, the name their grandfather called them. And it sort of, or at least to me, those characters are much more defined. And these characters, I feel like one of the things is he's using the assumed knowledge, or the potentially assumed knowledge of the films that these are based on, to sort of build these characters up a little bit. And if you do not have that background knowledge, I feel like some of the characters aren't as well rendered because of that.
Right.
Like, for example, Freddy is such a zany character. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's a mythology to it. Like the 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. There's just a lot more that I like about it. There's supernatural rule sets. You know, there's metaphysical things. So that character, her path, and it seemed like a lot more realized. But even the main character, I hadn't seen Silent Night, Deadly Night, so I don't have that character in my mind. So I basically just ported Laurie Strode over to that character.
Totally. Yeah.
And I wonder if other people had that same experience. And if you had been a super fan of all these films, I wonder if that might have been even a little bit of like a blind spot with Grady Hendrix. Like these characters are so realized for him that maybe some of them got a little bit of short shrift and fade. But you can't do that for the antagonist. Like I still like don't really understand the motivation of the meta killers in this, you know?
Well, Sky's just like an angry boy who didn't get enough attention from his mom because she was spending too much energy being famous.
That feels really weak for this level of insanity.
On one hand, maybe. On the other hand, it's hard for me not to actually get the characters from Scream in my head and go like, what is it? Motivation is irrelevant, or what does he say?
But even that character like sort of advances this sort of like postmodern nihilist reasoning. That's not even here, you know, like maybe it is.
I can see what you're saying as it being weak, but I also feel like if you step back, there's this woman, she's a therapist. She's built her entire career on helping traumatized women who are the victims of serial killers cope with their trauma. As a consequence of that, she completely ignores her male children. And those male children are actually become fucked up, and they're defined by being ignored for the sake of these women who are traumatized by men. And they become traumatizers.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a cycle that is...
You remember that op-ed that woman wrote? She's like, I'm raising two boys and I'm worried I might be raising rapists. And it was just completely shitty, breathless, like basically her teenage kids are just teenage kids. And she's like one of these like hyper blue-haired feminist types that like no one likes, even feminists don't like. And it was just like so disrespectful to her children to be like, I think it's completely possible that these kids could be like Duke Lacrosse rapists. And it was at the time of the whole Duke Lacrosse thing, which ended up being a hoax. I don't know if you knew about that.
No.
Like that woman lied, and all those kids like basically like they didn't go to jail. Like there's definitely like shitty shit that happens in frats and stuff like that, but that wasn't one of them.
Are you talking about the Rolling Stone expose?
That's a different one. Okay. That one is also another hoax.
Yeah.
I could see if that therapist had been a little bit more like that and had like driven, like I would have liked to have seen him driven to that by her, other than just being like, Mom didn't pay attention to me. Like, I just don't think that's your natural move. Or if the girlfriend had been like a little bit more assertive and manipulative, it would have been a little bit.
Stephanie?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if she was a little bit more of a mastermind, I think that kind of would have been a cool touch, because it's like, hey, look, here's a female monster. Like
totally. But I feel like that would shift everything about this book, because in the end, she is a pawn. She is yet another victim of another layer of male violence, that even though she was trying to become a slasher, she couldn't. Mm-hmm. She was actually a different kind of victim of Sky. And in the end, she never actually successfully killed anybody and joins the support group.
That it just seems like it's like asserting the sort of like sisterhood idea.
Well,
when
it's very powerful.
Yeah, of course. You know, they travel around with the pants and whatnot. Isn't that a thing?
It's a thing.
Yeah. Obviously, this doesn't have to comport to the rules, but it's so built on the rules that when you step away from it, it seems like there should be a reason for it. I guess like Stephanie just doesn't feel like a final girl pursuing monster to me. It's like kind of a different thing, and it can be a different thing, and that's fine. It's just maybe there's just like it's just lacking a certain amount of symmetry that I think would maybe be more pleasing or something. I don't know. Who knows?
I think that her character and Sky's characters aren't really fleshed out so very much that might give us a little more of maybe something more to chew on that might make them a little more satisfying. But I do feel like Lynette is she's kind of the only one I think that they are all pretty fucking solid characters. They're all pretty interesting and idiosyncratic, and nobody's a stereotype. And I like the way he's written these characters, but Lynette is the one that we get a lot of depth from. Yeah. I'm curious, going back to the sort of retro question, which keeps coming up again and again on this podcast. So this book has the black character, black guy dies first, even though it's a woman. Adrienne is the first of their support group to die. And I think it rides that problematic of it's true to form, but it's also fucking tired. And this book isn't about true to form. It's very odd. I'm very curious about Grady Hendrix's decision to sort of like follow that trope when this book isn't that kind of metatext to like, well, there's rules. This book doesn't follow the rules of slasher films.
No, yeah, it's not like wired on them like Scream is.
Right. And so the choice to follow the trope of killing off the black character first is very peculiar to me.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, and then there's the idea.
Am I getting that right?
I mean, like, again, like having read this, like I just finished a few days ago. Like some of these details are a little bit murky to me. He's definitely making a specific move where he's like, oh, this character was whitewashed, so he's kind of making a statement about like whitewashing characters, and that's kind of interesting. And then another interview, he talked about like how much research he did, and how the most research he did was on like how wheelchairs work, because he wanted to get that really right. So he had this like kind of idea that he wanted to have a wheelchair using character and have that character. So he's caring about representing these different people with these different experiences accurately. But I mean, at this point, I don't know, like, okay, so you have a black character in a horror film. If you don't kill him, are you like pandering and winking? And if you do kill him first,
well, kill them or kill them first.
I think at this point, any like the tolerance is like you either got to live or you don't, or you're like, it's like you either live and it's a Jordan Peele movie, or you don't live and it's a normal movie.
Right, but for me, it's about killing off the black character first. Like
the first to die.
Just the first to die. It's this cliche. We all know it's a cliche. It is lampshaded. It's commented on. It's one of the biggest tropes of the slasher genre. And he included it. And this book is about slashers, but it is not adhering to tropes of slashers. So it sort of begs the question, like, I'm just going to go with, I've been watching like older movies on the Criterion channel lately, not much, but a bit. And it is shocking how fucking racist mid-century Hollywood was. Like, outrageously racist. And, objectionable in countless other ways. So when we go retro, what do we drag along for authenticity, and why? Do we really need to sort of like reify these stereotypes to sort of go like, see? I think it's a question when going retro or being fascinated by earlier times. I think it's like being invested in cowboy culture of any sort, whether it's movies or clothing. It's hard not to view that as also embracing all the shitty aspects of it. So when we love slashers, well, do you like black characters being the most erasable? Like they're there for haha color, but actually you got to get rid of them as quickly as possible so that we don't dwell, so that they're not really part of the conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like a book like this is not just existing as like an homage to slashers, but it's also interacting with the volumes of like just shitty secondary literature about slashers. I mean, which like I was even thinking about whether or not, looking back on it, I even buy the premise of Men, Women, and Chainsaws. Like she makes the statement that like, oh, well, people are actually identifying with the final girl. Do we know that? Like that book is not like a very strict study or anything like that. Like she just kind of has this idea of it that we identify this with this slasher woman. And I was thinking about like, do you necessarily even need to identify with the woman or the slasher? Can't you just, because the way I experience them is I'm just looking at it as a holistic story. I'm not really necessarily like drilling down, putting myself into either. Like what about people who don't have to put themselves into the the misogynistic fantasy of Michael Myers or the uplifting story of the woman surviving? Like I don't even know that is real.
I think it is.
I mean, that's going to be like, that's definitely going to ruffle people. I think like people like might disagree, but like, it's almost like a parallel, a very radioactive parallel is that White Fragility book where the woman writes this book and she's like, well, I went to a barbecue and I was looking for my white friends and I only saw black people and I was like alarmed. And then I realized I had to interrogate my racism from that. Like, I don't think I would have that reaction if I was looking for a barbecue and there was a barbecue with black people. I would just be like, hey, I'm looking for this other group. Have you seen anybody like that? And that would be it. Like I wouldn't have like had this like existential moment there. And I don't know that everybody has an existential moment with these horror films. I think that might be like a very like recent and modern sort of like take on this shit. Like our show. Like why can't we just watch these fucking shows and enjoy them? Why do we have to like do this podcast?
But I don't know that Carol Clover, the author of Men, Women, and Chainsaws, is necessarily positing that people are having these existential self-revelatory moments, that these 14-year-old boys are having some sort of conscious subjectivity pivoting moments with these slasher films. I think that it's more about when you watch a movie, you tend to identify with the protagonist. That's how most cinema works. And in these movies, we don't necessarily know that these women are the protagonists because you're just watching mostly. Halloween's an exception because you know Laurie Strode is the protagonist. But you don't know that Ripley is the protagonist of Alien until, or like Friday the 13th, I forget the character's name, but you don't know that she's the final girl until the others are weeded out. But we do identify with protagonists. I think that's how fiction and film generally works. And slasher cinema is one of the only genres in the history of Hollywood, where women are protagonists. Romantic comedies barely have women as protagonists, but slasher films do. And so her question is, why are all these 14-year-old boys obsessed with movies where women are the protagonists?
Do you think the Roadrunner is the protagonist of the Roadrunner and Coyote? Like, do you think of the Roadrunner as why not?
Because it's boring. Point well made. But I think the whole thing is complicated because we, in a sense, root for Jason, Michael Myers, Freddy, etc. But we are watching it ultimately through the eyes of the final girl.
I disagree.
That is the subjectivity of the lens. I think that slasher movies, in thinking about the gaze, we are constantly pivoting back and forth between Michael Myers staring through the Halloween mask before he stabs his sister to death and Laurie Strode, not necessarily POV, the gaze. We don't see her POV the way we see Michael Myers sort of like walking around the house. But the way the gaze works in these films is you're constantly scanning the room like you're a victim, like you're Laurie Strode. You're looking in the corner. Where's the killer? Where's the killer going to come from? You're on edge, like the character. And that's the identification, I believe. It's not absolute.
Yeah, I know it's not. I just feel like that whole idea of like identification, which is sort of like a very important part of Men, Women, and Chainsaws. I'm not going to dismiss it like it's not like it's like, I don't even know how she got there. Like I'm not saying that. I just think that like her premise and like our premise really, like, cause I mean, I think she's so influential. I just keep thinking back to like that Roadrunner and Coyote stuff. Like maybe you're just watching mayhem. And maybe I'm also a sociopath and I just don't identify with people's faces.
Sure.
You know? But yeah, I just don't like that's one of the things that one of the reasons why I don't think I enjoy these movies that much is I don't really like identify with anything in them. It just seems like a series of things that are happening with like, it's just like a very light plot to get you into like some great Tom Savini special effects.
Oh, sure.
You know, and then to me, like anything beyond that, it's just like you're sort of like you're just doing work that no one needs. Maybe
You're the one who went to UC Berkeley.
Hey, look,
that's more work that no one needs.
The only thing that anybody needs from Berkeley is the nuclear shit that they develop. Everything else is irrelevant.
Carol Clover teaches at UC Berkeley, everybody.
Does she?
Does she still? I mean, that's where she taught when she wrote Men, Women, and Chainsaws.
That makes perfect sense.
Oh, yeah.
What department?
I think film studies, which has a lot of, I think, did Rhetoric spin out of film studies or vice versa?
That's a tough question. I definitely took film classes and rhetoric classes, and it was like basically the same department.
Yeah, I think they might have used to have been.
Yeah, I think it probably was the same department at one point. It's such a UC Berkeley rhetoric book. I mean, it really is.
Sure.
Like, and to me, like the definition of that would be like, yeah, I get the point, but like, so what? You know, like
it's interesting.
It's interesting, but like, is it right? Like, you're making a claim. I mean, and then these people.
Well, question of asking if it's right is incredibly patriarchal.
That's what I was
very uncomfortable.
That was the thing I was about to say. After that is like you get to the question of like, oh, you know, what's at stake? Is it right? Is this? And then that whole crew, they just back up into like, well, what is right? And like, who are you to even ask? And you're like, fuck, I'll checkmate, I guess. You know, like let's get further into like obscure little corners of our own minds. Like,
I just I just think of it as poetry. I just think of it as art. It's just spinning ideas in an interesting, creative way that makes you see something from another side. It's almost like more literature.
Your position on that has been extremely influential on me, and what it's made me over the last few years of doing this podcast, like go back and revisit a lot of the stuff that I was like, what the fuck is the point of this nonsense? Like this doesn't even like comport to reality.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh, okay, this is just some outsider art, basically. Like, and then it made me enjoy all of it a lot more.
Outsider art within the institution.
Yeah. I mean, will you really get to that? Like, I mean, I don't know if I've ever told you or even on this podcast how I ever even ended up as a rhetoric major.
Maybe.
It was like a performance. Like, so there's this thing when you're transferring into Berkeley, for the most part, it's like 17-year-olds and their parents coming to check the school out to make sure that they are going to like, it's going to be fine. But
right.
Which is weird because it's like you're desperately trying to get into Berkeley. Like anyone accepted to it, like unless you had an offer to Stanford or something, like you're stoked. You don't need to come look at the school, but they have this day. And as a transfer student from City College, I was able to go to that day. And I was pretty sure I was going to be an English major. Like, because I was like, I like books. This is a department about books. This is a world-class department. And I missed the English department presentation. So I was like, fuck, what am I going to do? And so I just wandered into this other one, which happened to be the rhetoric department. And the way it was done is all these students got up in front of the class and started talking about this fucking insane critical theory shit and imitating professors presenting the critical theory to give you a taste of what it was like. And these fucking kids walked the room. It was amazing. Like parents and kids got up and walked the fuck out. And I was like one of like the only people left. I was like, this is amazing. This is all me. I'm all into it. And that's how I chose a rhetoric major.
You were so wrong. You were so misled about what you wanted.
Yeah. I was kind of like, had this very like, I wanted school to be, I don't know what I wanted. It was definitely not, a career was not what I was thinking. I desperately didn't want to bartend anymore. Like that was really my main gig.
And you saw these grad students and you were like, they are a guiding light.
But I'm so like drawn to insanity that I couldn't help myself.
Yeah.
You know, and then later on I figured out like so many of these kids end up in law school, like it sort of kind of made more sense. But yeah, I'm so drawn to this madness.
Yeah.
Weird. I kind of wish I was more oriented towards accepting all the shit like off the shelf, but I think maybe it's better that I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who knows? Speaking of that, like crass concern over like money and stuff, like one of my favorite things about Grady Hendrix is somebody asked him what he's most afraid of. And he had the greatest answer I've ever heard. He said, being broke. And he's like, it sounds silly, but he's like, when the rent's due and your credit cards are maxed out and you don't know what to do, he's like, that's real fear. And I think that like, I've never heard a more relatable answer to that question.
Totally. Well, it's also very grounding
Yeah,
that he's
totally.
like this horror novel. I mean, he's getting pretty big,
I wonder what he.
but he's like, what am I afraid of? And he's got a class consciousness
I mean, it's
response, you
great,
know?
and I think he's talked about how, like, in 2008, basically the bottom fell out of the kind of journalism he was doing. Yet people still go to that type of journalism school and rack up like 100K in debt. Like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, you should be going to horror novel school because, like, you probably have a better chance.
Yeah. I'm gonna change the subject a bit, but another thing in this book that I really dug was, okay, in our previous episode about Halloween 2018, we discussed that there is this scene where one of the teenagers says something to the effect of, what, some guy killed a bunch of babysitters a couple of like decades ago, whatever, in comparison. And
Yeah, it's
obviously,
like 5 people is no big deal. We like more kids get killed at that at Columbine or whatever.
yeah. And I sort of dig the way that Stephanie and Skye in this book reify that sentiment, where it's actually on the table. They address it directly, but also that their project, perhaps Skye's project, is to erase final girls from the equation. Like, it's almost a form of letting a new generation take over. Serial killers killing a couple of people a long time ago is irrelevant compared to today's violence that teens can potentially face. And they are going to react against it so hard. They are going to erase actually the survivors of those serial killers. That's how irrelevant they are. They just want to like kill them and move on to a new era.
Yeah.
So we can stop thinking and dwelling on final girls.
Yeah, I think of all the parts of the book, that sort of like little part was the thing I thought about the most afterwards for like 2 reasons. One, I liked that there was this sort of like mythopoetic force that just shut that down. It's like, no, slashers have fucking knives. This gun thing's not working in this universe. Like, it sort of didn't work.
Yeah.
And in the same way that like Lynette's guns, like, it's almost like
they keep trying to insert guns into the equation.
Right. And it's like the equation is rejecting it. And it sort of reminds me of the dragon episode of Rick and Morty, where Rick goes to the magical world and his science doesn't work anymore.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It was like, I was like, oh, it sort of has that feel to it that like the vibe of the universe sort of cancels out reality. And I really liked that. But then I also thought about like what happens to the survivors of mass shootings is that they sort of get conscripted into like one of the 2 political gangs. And I think that's really fucked up. Like, you either end up like that David Hogg kid where you're like, you're basically like a CNN mouthpiece for like, oh, these sad kids. Or you're like one of the other kids. Like, I think one of them is like basically the Fox News version of that. Like, where he's like, actually, if we had guns, none of this would have happened. Like, I think it's really sad that these kids, I mean, I don't know them obviously, but it just feels like their trauma is so co-opted by major forces that it just seems awful. Like, I definitely, like, if a bunch of my friends got killed at school, the last thing I would want to do is be on TV or fucking hustling up money for fucking Nancy Pelosi or whatever, you know?
So Stephanie never actually kills anyone. And so Lynette sort of gives her a pass. Like, okay, she's technically a final girl and she didn't actually kill anyone, even though she really tried. So ... And it really got me thinking about the difference between murder and attempted murder. And that how if you're inept, that's somehow more forgivable.
Yeah, it's so crazy to me that like an attempted murder charge is so low. It's like you just got slightly less lucky.
That's what I mean.
And it's just like the intent was there. Like,
Yeah.
you had and this, like, the way the court system works with like intent and intent, like the difference between first degree, second degree, and third degree murder. To me, it's always been a little bit weird because it's like, same thing with hate crimes. Like, because you don't like this person, Like, does the motivation like change the result? To me, like the emphasis should be on the result. Like, I mean, especially in this situation, like, you know, these several of these women end up like permanently fucked up.
Yeah.
I tell you what, like, if somebody shot me in the foot and it took a minute off of my mile time, I would still want that person to die and rot in jail. Like, I mean, it's just weird. On the record, like, there's all this stuff like Robert Kennedy's murderer just got out on parole, or he might go on parole or whatever. If I'm ever killed by anyone, I let it be on the record that I want them to fucking get the chair. Like, you know, that's just me. But
Yeah.
I know, but yeah, the whole idea of like redeeming that woman and making her part of the group, it's so alien to my sensibility that I can't even tell if it makes sense in the book or not.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, what do you think? You're Canadian.
I feel like it makes sense in the book. How does my former national identity? What?
Once people get out of going to jail for like 6 months, and then they just let them back out into like Montessori schools or whatever in Canada.
Yes, Canada. In Canada, there's no murder, but if you do happen to murder, you go to Montessori school.
I think that's how it works.
Canada's just a different culture. Like, the level of violence is just so profoundly lower than it is here. Seems slightly better to me, but I also chose not to live there because it's kind of boring.
Yeah, I mean, just fucking prison itself in America is just insane. Like, if you're in for more than a couple of years, you basically have to join a racial gang.
Yep.
Like, at least in California, do you do? I mean,
It's actually, I just had a conversation with someone today who was like talking about his friend is in the Hells Angels, and it's because he went to prison. He's just like a regular guy, went to prison, had to make a choice. Now he's a Hells Angel for life.
Yeah.
That's the way it is.
Did you see the movie Shot Caller?
No, what's that?
It's basically about a guy who's like kind of a white collar dude, and he's been drinking, and he basically goes to prison on a manslaughter charge because he's drunk driving and somebody dies. And while he's in there, it becomes immediately apparent that the situation is fucking gnarly. And he's like, well, I don't want to be fucking gang raped by like these dudes over here, so I'm just going to go join this Aryan Brotherhood gang.
Yeah.
Because it's like, obviously I'm not black, so I'm not joining that gang, and I'm not Mexican, I can't join that gang. So there's only one restaurant that's open for me. And so it's basically about his decision to sort of join this gang for protection, and then how they manipulate him into like doing shit, and it adds like all these years onto his sentence, and which happens for real all the time.
Yeah.
And how he just eventually is like, well, I'm never getting the fuck out of here. So he like becomes like a shot caller, is what, you know, like a boss basically. It's a pretty good like prison drama. It has like some really good murder scenes. To me, that's so much more compelling than any slasher because it's sort of rooted in reality, even though it's not. I mean, it's hyper reality.
So a friend of mine is a tattoo artist. He's been a tattoo artist for a long, long time. And he was telling me about, he had this guy come in, this young white guy.
Oh, I know this story. Tell this story. This story is great.
Gather around, listeners. This young white guy comes in, and he wanted my friend to tattoo the continent of Africa on his face, on his cheek. And his explanation was, I'm about to get sentenced, and so I'm going to go to prison, and I want to fall in with the right people.
It's such a delusional.
It's amazing.
It's a totally delusional idea.
There's more to the story. He refused him. Mm-hmm. And years later, he's hanging out. He's at a party with a bunch of other tattoo artists, and they're swapping crazy tattoo stories. And one of his friends, one of his colleagues, goes, oh my God, man, there was this one time this white kid came in and he wanted me to tattoo Africa on his face. And my friend goes, what did you do? And he goes, I took his money and tattooed his face. I don't give a shit.
Man, I would love to know what that person's story
ended up being.
That kid is
dead.
There's no way.
Did not survive a month in prison.
I mean, goddamn, like what a bad idea to think that you're gonna like. It's so weird. Like when you see like people just have no idea of like the dynamics of a situation. Like there was one of these like last summer, one of these like, you know, riots or protests, whatever, depending on how you view them. This white dude was like in the middle of an area, and there's a bunch of like black kids just fucking stuff up, and they have a bunch of black kids looting and fucking stuff up. It's like, to me, it's the most fun option. Like for sure, if I was a teenager, I would want to be looting and busting stuff up and getting sneakers and stuff. Like it to me, it's the most honest option for like a scene like that. And so they were just beating the fuck out of these people around him, like basically anybody who was white. And this he's like, I'm Jewish. Is like, what are you doing, dude? Like, do you not know at all that dynamic, like the inner city dynamic with the people, like Farrakhan has been spewing his ideas for quite some time, and that scene is not having it. It's just like, why do you think that it's just weird, like when people think that their particular identity is going to naturally gel with another identity because they're one of the good ones. The whole idea that you're like you could be an animal rescue person and you go into the fucking Serengeti. The lion does not care if you're one of the good ones. It's just going to lion on you, and it's not the lion's fault in the way that it wouldn't be those kids' fault. Like, you shouldn't be there as this like nebbish fuck who thinks he's down for the cause. I don't know. I mean, again, like we're back to like, I can't think of anything more horrifying than being caught in a crowd. Like, that is my fear. Like, it's like just crowd violence is extremely terrifying to me.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Someone hiding in the corner of your bedroom, you have a chance.
I have a good chance.
A mob?
Yeah.
Zero chance.
One-on-one.
That's why zombies are, to me, far more frightening.
Oh, yeah. I think because it's just this unstoppable, unreasonable force, this mass, this wave crashing on you that you can't reason with. Like in my house, like a one-on-one, I have a chance of like taking you out, like a pretty good chance. Like in a group of like 50 people, I'm going to get Reginald Denny'd. Like, that's not what I want to have happen.
So I often wonder when looking at horror if the monster in the broadest sense, is something that's being repurposed from its origins to address a more contemporary concern.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a little bit of how does this address contemporary neuroses and anxieties. Is there something in this book that feels like it's addressing what we're concerned with now? We talked last episode about we're not afraid of slashers. Not really. Like, that's not a thing that we're anxious about.
He walks out in the book a little bit the idea that like the people who consume the stories of this mayhem are sort of its own sort of monster. Like, so our consumption of the story, but he doesn't really back, like that to me is a little bit like the movie Natural Born Killers. That's the Natural Born Killers take, where it's like, we, the audience, are complicit and we are the monsters, and I feel like he just doesn't like walk that out as much. Like, I feel I don't want to be broke a lot more than I feel any sort of like other horror on top of this.
Yeah.
I mean, that's when it gets to be like, oh, is this just kind of like a riff, like does it need to address a real existing horror?
No.
Like, that makes this more of like an homage than a true horror to me.
That's, because retro stuff, sometimes it can feel contemporary, but not necessarily.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So Lynette, part of her not entirely reliable narrator is she doesn't roll out that she has written a book until maybe a third into Final Girl Support Group. We don't learn that she actually has written a book.
I love that part of this book.
What do you think of, what do you think of her having done that?
Well, I think it's kind of like, I think it's very realistic, because anytime somebody goes through something really publicly traumatic, there is an industry that can help you get that story out for profit, So I think it's very realistic that that she would have been approached. I think her reasoning that I love the reason she gives is seen as clearly bullshit by everybody. Like when she's like, oh, I was just, writing it to process the trauma. And they're like, yeah, bullshit. I think that's one of the parts where the characters really come alive and feel real in a really great way. I mean, and that's another thing. As much as I sort of like dismiss this entire genre in some ways as not being like high lit, these characters are alive, in a way that is very difficult for most people to pull off. And I think the more I listen to Grady Hendrix himself, the more I admire his take on all of this. Like, he talked about like, you can see when horror writers are writing books because they think they're going to get deals to have them turned into movies. And my buddy Brian Thies, who's like a pretty accomplished comic book illustrator, he works for Dark Horse. He worked on the Alien versus Predator, just really great guy. He said that like there's so much pressure in the industry to just basically make a comic that's like an 8-part pitch for a Netflix series. And he said what it's doing is it's ruining the form of the comic books because people are writing these scenes almost as like storyboards for the story that they're going to sell. And one of the interviews I listened to with Grady Hendrix is probably some sort of like writer podcast, like writing advice. And he's like, you have to be very careful with developing the interior life of these characters. And that the better you do that, the more realistic it's going to be. And that's straight out of Schopenhauer's essay on literature. Like he says the same exact thing, that like the external events almost don't matter. It's the internal space that really matters for great books. And I think he's done a really great job of that in a really corny setting.
I like also that, speaking to what you said earlier about her bullshit reasoning for writing this book, is that it speaks to the many layers of predation that happen around the scenario of death and these women's suffering and trauma. And in terms of layers, it's interesting that, so the first layer would be the final girls and their slashers. And then there's this next layer, which is this sort of like meta commentary, but the villains of this book are meta commentary.
Yes.
They are this sort of like second layer that's predatory on the original fabric. But outside of that is the murderabilia. I think his name is Garrett, the cop with the cowboy hat.
Yeah.
He's always angling for camera time and FaceTime and a book deal. And then it's very easy for us to believe that Dr. Carroll is the one pulling the strings when Lynette believes it, because Dr. Carroll is a celebrity. Mm-hmm. She's in the papers showing her face and getting her photograph taken. There are just so many ways that it's not just these men killing these people. It's not just these men chasing these women. There's also this very elaborate culture that is set up to continually be predators.
Yeah. If you were going to write like a paper about this book, you could very easily write something on the theme of like the media monetization of women's suffering and like all the people who are complicit in it. And I think that like back to that question you asked a while ago about like, what is the horror here? I think that, or what is the monster here? It's just that there's an entire industry for this. But at the same time, like this shit is delightful, for whatever reason. It's just,
well, I mean,
it's fun.
I gotta say, I didn't know anything about the actress from the first two Friday the 13th movies, but I gotta say, the second I heard there was a story, I immediately went and looked it up because I wanted to know what the hell. And it was hard not to go like, wait, what? She had this woman from a horror movie had a stalker? Who was that? Why? What the fuck happened?
Yeah, I almost even feel like that story itself would make such an interesting story. Like you could do like totally like what's the Friday the 13th where it's like they're on the set of Friday the 13th, the next nightmare or something like that.
Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street?
It's Nightmare on Elm Street. It's
New Nightmare.
New Nightmare. That's the one.
Yeah.
You could almost see.
So good.
Yeah, you could almost see her story told, but like punched up a little bit, where the person's like a little more dangerous, with like in between the two Friday the 13th movies. I think that would make a really fun.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. God, I wonder if she'd be willing to go through that.
She has a Crystal Lake wine company.
I know, but that's very different from having your traumatic life experience.
I mean, she
documented.
She told the story to Peaches Christ. So, I mean, I feel like
again, I think there's a difference between telling someone on a podcast and like, well, I mean, again, this goes back to Scream. Sydney's exposure to the Stab movie franchise.
Yeah,
it's fucking ugly.
I mean, and then also,
But also in this book, Adrienne is like leans right the fuck into it and
Yeah.
takes it away from them and keeps going.
yeah. And then, like, is your crazy story, do you want to build a career out of it? I mean, look at Bert Kreischer and the robbing the Russian train story. Like, that's
Amazing.
literally a story that was just told in a podcast and was, at the time, the greatest story that had ever been told on any podcast.
Yeah, still is.
It still probably is. And I mean, that guy is.
We're talking about Bert Kreischer's The Machine story for anybody who doesn't know what we're talking about.
And if you're not like, our brand of bro, it's still probably worth watching.
I do like that in a different way from Halloween 2018, Lynette's paranoid worldview is completely histrionic and totally correct. Like, she spent so many years being terrified of the world and having these very elaborate rituals to keep herself safe that just seem totally neurotic. But actually, in the end, they were totally justified.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's so similar to Halloween 2018. It's hard to like really think about them separately.
Yeah.
Like
that aspect is, yeah.
Yeah, that aspect particularly, like the cage around the door to me has a little bit more in common with Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. Like the scene where they have the weed dealers in that movie have the cage that you have to stand in before they let you in to buy weed. Like, so a cage at the door has always seemed like a really good idea to me. You'd be able to trap somebody in it. But yeah, I feel like these people are dealing with, they're not supernatural. Well, maybe they are supernatural. The one character could be supernatural. Like, obviously killing in your dreams is not realistic at all. I don't know. If you had to take on one of these classic slashers, who do you think you would have the best chance against?
I have not seen everything from every franchise, but at least going by, I mean, there are plenty of minor ones like Happy Birthday to Me or Sleepaway Camp. Those are, they're just people killing. They're not supernatural. So when you get into something like Friday the 13th and the later ones, they're completely unstoppable and there's nothing you can do. The way, and nobody really survives those. There are final girls, but they're not in the next movie, so who the fuck knows?
Yeah, like Jason in space, the fact that you have to blow him up and then shoot him into space, like it's unrealistic.
Yeah. Totally
unrealistic. Why not shoot him into the fucking sun if you're going to go to that much trouble? I mean, it's so stupid. Okay, say you have
abide.
You have to deal with one of these characters in the first two films of their franchise. So before they get superpowered, who do you think you would do the best against?
Michael Myers. Mm-hmm. I think that one thing that is part of early slasher movies is that, to exaggerate, there's never a double tap. Mm-hmm. So it's like stupid kids who, if they just get a little edge up on the slasher, like if they trip them, they run. Or if they'll like hit him with a tire iron once and run. Nobody is willing to finish the job until the final girl. And I think if someone like you or I were confronted by a very basic Michael Myers or Jason or Jason's mommy, that finishing the job would actually be part of the assignment.
Right.
Yeah, I was just watching, again, Silent Night, Deadly Night, and like he's a totally inept, fumbling killer. Makes me think the movie's Canadian.
Yeah, probably.
I don't know.
The other one's Canadian, the other Christmas murder movie.
Oh, Black Christmas.
Yeah.
Fucking amazing.
Yeah.
What about you?
I think that, well, I mean, if we're dealing with the first two films, in Nightmare on Elm Street, it's established that you can just turn your back on him and go, I don't believe in you. And I don't believe in anything as a nihilist. So I think I would maybe be able to like just turn him off.
I think that's a bad faith, not you, but I think that is a bad faith runaround on how to defeat Freddy, because you can't be confronted by something that is actually murdering people and go, I don't believe in you.
I totally agree. It doesn't make any sense in the film.
That is like, there's no there.
Yeah. But if not that, Probably Mike. I think Michael Myers is a bitch, man. I think like you could anyone with any revolver could stop him. Like if
You'd have to unload the whole thing, as we learned in 2018. But
yeah. But like, yeah, I mean, the whole point of like, yeah, you just stay and make sure like it's all ready. I'm so curious how Halloween Kills will work out because it seems to be that the town goes after him like that in the trailer. It seems like,
I haven't seen the trailer.
yeah, it's basically like the trailer is he walks out of the house, it's burning down, he murders all the firemen, which is kind of a cool looking scene. And then obviously he's part of the Taliban. And then it seems like they sort of like rally the town to go take him on. Like I'm really curious how that works.
Could be cool.
Yeah. You know what? Thankfully, at least they've never had him doing anything super stupid like Michael Myers doing parkour or something like to chase after people.
Good Lord.
That would be pretty terrible.
You mean Jason?
No, Michael Myers.
I'm sorry. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
All these characters like blur together to me. I still think like the idea of redoing the Monster Squad, but instead of having famous monsters, you would have 80 slashers would be such a killer idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because then you get to blend like the meta narrative with like the strange. It could be super nostalgic, like Stranger Things, like basically like these characters chasing around kids on bikes in a suburb. It's a license to print money, I think.
So what have we learned?
I have learned that you don't have to make great literature, but you can make fun literature as long as you take it seriously, and it can be quite great. Like I'm very inspired by Grady Hendrix, even though I do not think his work will be remembered. I think he is aware of that and is making an awesome thing for right now.
Well, I think that connects to a question that you raised off mic, which is, do you need to be invested in slasher films to enjoy this book? And I think potentially not. I think it's sort of like going back to my talking about like you're confronted by a Caravaggio.
Mm-hmm.
It's still clearly amazing whether or not you know who the hell all these people are in the painting. It sure helps. It sure gives depth. But it's still pretty amazing, even if you have just the roughest outline of who these people are.
Yeah.
Of who that Jesus Christ guy is.
Yeah. Earlier when we talked about this off mic, like whether or not you could enjoy this movie, I kind of was of the opinion that like it just wouldn't be as good. Like you just wouldn't get it. But then I thought about it. I was like, I have no idea what it's like to be somebody who's not immersed in all this stuff. Like this book might work awesome. Like to somebody who's never been exposed to these things. And then they're like, oh, what are these based on? And then all of a sudden they have probably hundreds of films to go watch.
Yeah.
You know, and I could see this book really unlocking a lot of really fun stuff. And I can't wait to see what his next book is. I'll buy it. Like I think that like, I love that he's not just being an author, like Horror Store, like the fact that it looks like an IKEA catalog and has those great illustrations. It just really, there's like a Walt Disney-ness about it. Like he's like plussing it up. Like it's the sort of same, like again, we talked about John Waters earlier. There's just something like really professional about what he's doing. Like in the way that Peaches Christ operates, you know, like I think that it's, I keep thinking about that anxiety of influence thing. It's like, what if you didn't have anxiety? What if it was just like delight of influence? Like that's cool. You know, you don't have to be a salty fuck about everything.
Is that it?
Yeah. Did you learn anything?
Always.
Yeah. All right, everybody, fuck off.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Let me look at my notes. I think I had some more salty Schopenhauer shit.